She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't confront him in the hallway or throw his indifference back in his face the way he perhaps deserved. After 4 years of cold dinners, empty chairs, and a husband who looked through her as though she were part of the wallpaper, Eleanor Sinclair did something far more devastating than any of that. She packed one bag, not her jewels, not the dresses society had admired, not the life she had been performing for 4 years, with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned very early that no one was coming to rescue her inside her own marriage. Just one bag, small enough to carry alone, light enough to leave quickly, careful enough to tell anyone who found it exactly what it meant, that the woman who had waited and hoped and tried in all the invisible ways that no one ever sees or credits had finally irrevocably stopped. He found it on a Thursday morning. The Duke of Ashford, powerful, composed, admired by every room he entered and present in almost none that mattered, pushed open the door to his wife's chamber and saw it sitting there in the center of the floor. And he stopped. The man who had never in his adult life been unable to move simply stopped. Because somewhere beneath the title and the distance and the years of carefully managed indifference, something recognized what that bag meant. Something understood that he was not looking at luggage. He was looking at the end of something he had never bothered to begin. What he found inside it would change everything. But by then, Eleanor had already made her decision. And the question that would haunt the next days of his life, the question he had no elegant answer for, no prepared response, no armor against, was not whether he could stop her. It was whether he had ever, in 4 years of marriage, given her a single reason to stay. This is that story. Eleanor Sinclair had stopped watching the door a long time ago. In the early days of their marriage, she would sit at the dinner table with the candle still lit, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes drifting toward the entrance hall every time she heard footsteps in the corridor. But the footsteps were always a servant's, always someone else. Never Sebastian. After 4 years, she had quietly rearranged her entire life around his absence. She dined alone. She walked the gardens alone. She attended the occasional social gathering with a practiced smile that revealed nothing. Not loneliness, not longing, not the dull ache that had settled somewhere behind her ribs and never quite left. The staff of Ashford Manor had grown used to her solitude. Some pitied her. None dared speak of it. What no one knew, not even Mrs. Aldwyn, who noticed everything, was that Eleanor had stopped grieving. Grief requires hope, and hope was the one thing she had finally, carefully set aside. She was not bitter. She was not broken. She was simply done. And that quiet finality, invisible to everyone around her, was the most dangerous thing in that entire house. If this story already has you feeling something, you're exactly where you belong. Here on DukeDom Stories, every video is a world of its own. Noble hearts, hidden pain, and the kind of love that only arrives after everything nearly falls apart. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the moment everything changes. On paper, the union between Eleanor Sinclair and Sebastian Holt, Duke of Ashford, was considered one of the finest matches of the season. She came from a respectable family with an unblemished name. He came with a title, an estate, and a fortune that made lesser men envious. The ceremony had been elegant. The guests had applauded. The flowers had been white and abundant, and everyone had agreed it was a very good match indeed. What no one applauded was what came after. Sebastian was not cruel. Eleanor had never been able to accuse him of that. He did not raise his voice. He did not humiliate her in public. He simply treated the marriage the way one treats a responsibility that has already been fulfilled, acknowledged, filed away, and rarely revisited. He was polite when they crossed paths. He was considerate when the situation required it, but he was never truly present. Not once in 4 years had he looked at her as though she were the reason he had entered a room. Eleanor had understood, somewhere in the 2nd year, that Sebastian had married her because it was time to marry, not because it was her. She had been suitable, acceptable, the kind of choice a man makes when he is thinking about duty and not about desire. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had told herself many things in those years. Most of them had stopped being true long before she was ready to admit it. Sebastian Holt was not a man who explained himself. He moved through London's most powerful circles with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to justify his decisions, not to society, not to his peers, and certainly not to the woman waiting at the head of a long candlelit table in a house he rarely slept in before midnight. His days were full. His obligations were real. He told himself that was enough. He had, in truth, thought very little about Eleanor's evenings. It was not indifference born of malice. It was the particular blindness of a man who had never been taught to look. His own parents had shared a name, an estate, and almost nothing else. Marriage, in his understanding, was a structure, not a feeling. You maintained it. You honored its obligations. You did not, under any circumstances, allow it to become a source of vulnerability. Vulnerability, Sebastian had learned early and at great cost, was the one luxury he could not afford. And so, the dinners went cold, and the candles burned down, and Eleanor Sinclair sat across from an empty chair so many times that she eventually stopped setting his place at all. Mrs. Aldwyn noticed the change on a Tuesday evening in November. She said nothing, but she remembered it, the way one remembers the small, quiet moments that only reveal their meaning much later. There was a period, somewhere in the middle of their 2nd year, when Eleanor had tried in the only way she knew how. She had rearranged the library because she had once overheard Sebastian mention in passing that he found it difficult to locate anything in there. She had spoken to the cook about his preferences, the things he favored at breakfast, the dishes he pushed aside without comment. She had worn the blue dress to the Harrington reception because someone had told her years before that blue suited her particularly well, and she had wanted, just once, to be the kind of woman a man like Sebastian actually noticed. He had looked at her that evening, briefly, with the same measured, courteous expression he offered everyone. He had said she looked well. Then, Lady Cecile Marne had appeared at the far end of the room in ivory and diamonds, and his attention had shifted with the effortless ease of a man who had never had to choose between the two women, because in his mind there had never been a choice to make. Eleanor had driven home alone that night, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the passing darkness outside the carriage window. She had not cried. She had done something quieter and more permanent than crying. She had made a small, internal note, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply settles into the foundation of a person and waits. She had noted that trying for her in this marriage led nowhere. And she had begun, very slowly, to stop. Lady Cecile Marne had never pretended not to want what she wanted. That, Eleanor had long ago decided, was perhaps the only thing she genuinely respected about the woman. Cecile moved through society with the confidence of someone who had never once been made to feel like a second option. Her beauty was the kind that rooms acknowledged before she spoke, and her wit was sharp enough that men leaned in and women smiled carefully and said nothing unkind within her hearing. She and Sebastian had a history that predated Eleanor entirely. No one spoke of it directly. That was not how things were done in their world. But it lived in the way Cecile said his name at gatherings, in the half-second too long that Sebastian's gaze sometimes lingered before he looked away, in the particular quality of silence that fell between them in certain rooms. Eleanor had never confronted it. Confrontation would have required her to claim something, and claiming required believing she had a right to what she was claiming. What made Cecile truly dangerous was not ambition. It was patience. She had never needed to rush. She had simply remained, season after season, a permanent and elegant presence at the edges of a marriage she clearly did not consider permanent. And Sebastian, to his profound and unexamined fault, had never once given her a reason to believe otherwise. That was the wound Eleanor carried deepest, not the rival herself, but the husband who had never bothered to close the door. It was a Wednesday morning in early spring when Eleanor Sinclair looked at herself in the mirror and made a decision so small that no one would ever notice it, and so final that everything after it was different. She had been sitting at her vanity, her maid arranging the soft curls at the side of her face, when she caught her own reflection and recognized with perfect clarity what she was doing. She was preparing herself for a man who would not look at her. She had been doing it for 4 years. She told the maid to leave her hair simple, no curls, no careful arrangement, just something clean and unadorned, the way she had worn it as a girl before she had learned to perform elegance for an audience that never arrived. The maid obeyed without question, though she exchanged a brief glance with herself in the mirror that Eleanor pretended not to see. It was such a small thing, and yet the woman who rose from that chair and walked down the corridor of Ashford Manor that morning carried herself differently, not with defeat, but with something almost like relief. Sebastian passed her in the entrance hall that afternoon. He nodded. He said good afternoon. He did not notice her hair. Eleanor had not expected him to, but for the first time in a very long time, his lack of notice did not sting. It simply confirmed what she had already decided. She was no longer arranging herself around his gaze. She was no longer waiting to be seen, and that shift, invisible, interior, absolute, was the beginning of the end of everything. It was Lord Harrington's wife who first said it aloud, in the kind of low, careful voice women use when they want to be overheard by exactly the right people. She had been standing near the window at the Pemberton dinner, watching Eleanor move through the room, graceful, composed, speaking to no one for longer than necessary. And she had leaned toward the woman beside her and said that it was a terrible shame, really. That the Duchess of Ashford was the sort of woman a man ought to cherish, and that Sebastian Holt had apparently never received that particular piece of wisdom. The remark traveled, as remarks do, through drawing rooms and morning calls and the careful margins of afternoon correspondence. Most people agreed, in the private way that people agree when they feel something is true, but would never say so to the person it concerned. Eleanor Sinclair had arrived in their world as a quiet, dignified young woman, and 4 years of marriage had not diminished her. If anything, she had grown more composed, more self-possessed, more quietly striking than she had been as a bride. The contrast with her husband's public indifference had become, over time, impossible to ignore. Sebastian heard none of it. Or, perhaps more accurately, he was told none of it, because no one tells a duke that his drawing room is the subject of other people's pity. And so he continued attending his obligations, managing his estate, and moving through his marriage as though it were a room he had already memorized and no longer needed to examine. What he did not know, what no one had thought to warn him, was that the room was about to be emptied, and the absence, when it came, would be louder than anything that had come before. Mrs. Aldwyn found it first. She had gone to Eleanor's chamber on a Thursday morning to discuss the week's arrangements, and she had stopped in the doorway with her hand still on the frame and her mouth forming a word she did not say. The room was tidy. The bed was made. The vanity was clear of its usual small accumulation. The silver brush, the glass bottles, the folded handkerchief Eleanor kept near the mirror. And in the center of the room, sitting on the floor, with the quiet authority of a decision already made, was a single traveling bag, packed, closed, ready. It was not a large bag. That was the detail that undid Mrs. Aldwyn more than anything else. Not the fact of it, but the size of it. 4 years in that house, and Eleanor Sinclair had chosen to take almost nothing. A few dresses, perhaps, something personal. Whatever a woman takes when she is not planning to be comfortable, only free. Mrs. Aldwyn stood in that doorway for a long moment, and then she stepped back into the corridor and closed the door softly behind her, as though the bag were something sacred that ought not to be disturbed. She did not tell Sebastian. That was the choice she made in the corridor, quickly and without conflict, because some loyalties do not require deliberation. But she also did not tell Eleanor that she had seen it, because Eleanor had not asked to be witnessed in this. She had asked for nothing from anyone for a very long time. Mrs. Aldwyn walked back down the corridor with her hands folded and her expression unreadable, and she carried the weight of what she had seen in the particular silence of a woman who has watched something precious be wasted and can do nothing to restore it. Sebastian had gone to Eleanor's chamber for a reason he would later struggle to name precisely. It was not their custom to seek each other out. They existed in the same house the way two careful strangers might share a library, each occupying their corner, each respecting the other's silence. But something had shifted in him that morning, some unnamed discomfort he had been attempting to ignore since the night before, when he had looked across the Pemberton dining room and watched his wife speak to Lord Harrington's youngest son with a composure so complete, so entirely self-contained, that it had occurred to him, for the first time and with unpleasant clarity, that she was not waiting for him. He pushed open the door. The room was quiet and clean, and arranged with the particular neatness of a space that has been deliberately left behind. And there, in the center of the floor, was the bag. He saw it immediately. It was impossible not to see it. It sat there, with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as though it had been placed precisely where it could not be missed, not as an accusation, but as a simple, irrefutable statement of fact. She is leaving. She has already decided. This is what that looks like. He did not move. That was the thing he would remember afterward. Not what he thought, not what he felt, but the simple physical fact that his body refused to carry him forward. He stood in the doorway of his wife's chamber with one hand on the frame and his eyes on a traveling bag that was not large enough to hold 4 years of marriage, and something cracked open in him that had no name and no precedent in his experience. He had managed grief before, he had managed loss, but he had never before stood in a room and understood with absolute certainty that the loss had been entirely his own making. He's on his knees on the floor of her chamber. The bag is open. The dried flower is in his hand. And somewhere in this house, Eleanor Sinclair is already planning her goodbye. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Sebastian will let her go? Or will he finally become the man she deserved from the beginning? Drop your prediction in the comments. Will he fight for her? Will it be too late? Or is there something in that bag that changes absolutely everything? Tell me what you think is coming. Let's see who gets it right. He should not have opened it. He knew that some boundary of privacy and dignity made it clear that the bag was not his to examine, but his hand had moved before the thought completed itself, and the clasp had given way quietly, and Sebastian Holt, Duke of Ashford, found himself kneeling on the floor of his wife's chamber with the contents of her leaving spread before him. There was not much. A dress in soft gray, the one she had worn the first autumn of their marriage, the one he had not noticed then and could not explain why he remembered now. A small book with a cracked spine, the title worn away from handling. A folded letter he did not open, addressed in Eleanor's own hand to no one he recognized. Perhaps a friend, perhaps a relative, perhaps the only person she had trusted enough to tell. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of plain linen, a single dried flower, white, the kind that had been in abundance at their wedding. She had kept one. Through 4 years of silence and cold dinners, and a husband who had looked through her as though she were part of the architecture, she had kept one flower from the day she had married him. Sebastian sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. It was such a small thing to carry. It was such a devastating thing to find. And in the silence of that room, with the dried flower in his hand and the bag open at his knees, something in him shifted in a way that could not be undone. The way a door shifts when it has finally, irrevocably, been opened. Sebastian found Mrs. Aldwyn in the corridor outside the east wing, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carrying the particular neutrality of a woman who has been expecting a conversation and has already decided how much of it she will participate in. He asked the question plainly, without preamble, the way men ask questions when they are attempting to sound composed and are not quite succeeding. "Where's the Duchess?" Mrs. Aldwyn looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly appropriate for a member of staff addressing a duke. Then she told him that Her Grace had gone out, walking, she believed, alone as usual. The words landed quietly, as usual. He had not known it was usual. He had not known Eleanor walked alone. Not the frequency of it, not the habit of it, not the particular solitude it implied. He had lived in the same house as this woman for 4 years and had apparently learned almost nothing about her daily existence. The realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived the way most uncomfortable truths arrive, slowly and with the faint, humiliating quality of something that should have been obvious long ago. He did not go after her immediately. He stood in the corridor for a moment, the dried flower still in his coat pocket where he had placed it without quite deciding to, and he looked at the door at the end of the hall as though it might offer him something useful. Mrs. Aldwyn had already turned and walked away, which was, Sebastian understood, as close to a verdict as a loyal servant could deliver without crossing a line. He was alone in the corridor. He had been alone in this house, in all the ways that mattered, for 4 years. He simply had not noticed it until now. Eleanor was in the garden when she heard the door. She did not turn. She had been standing near the stone bench at the far edge of the grounds, the one half hidden by the old hedgerow, the one she had claimed early in their marriage as the only place in Ashford Manor that felt entirely hers. The morning was gray and cool, the kind of English morning that makes the world feel very still, and she had been standing there with her hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular, doing the quiet internal work of a woman who has already said goodbye to something and is simply waiting for her body to catch up. She had written the letter 3 days before. She had arranged what little she needed to arrange: a brief correspondence with her cousin in Edinburgh, a small sum set aside, a plan modest enough to be realistic and honest enough to be dignified. She was not running. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. Running implied fear, and she was not afraid of Sebastian. She was simply finished with being invisible inside a life that had her name on it. There was a difference, and it mattered to her enormously, even if no one else would ever understand it. When she finally turned, he was standing at the garden entrance, some 30 feet away, still in his morning coat, his hair not yet fully composed, which was unusual for him, she noticed. Sebastian was always composed. It was one of the things she had once admired and later come to find quietly devastating. But he was not composed now. He was standing at the edge of her garden with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face she had never seen before. Not in 4 years, not once. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away. Whatever that expression meant, it had arrived too late. He crossed the garden slowly, the way a man crosses a space when he is not certain he has the right to cross it. Eleanor did not move toward him, but she did not walk away either. And he understood that as the only invitation he was likely to receive, and took it carefully. When he reached her, he stopped a few feet away, which felt both too close and not nearly close enough, and he said her name. Just her name. Eleanor. In 4 years of marriage, he could not remember saying it the way he said it now. Not as an address, not as a formality, but as something that cost him something to speak aloud. He told her he had found the bag. She nodded, unsurprised, her eyes on the middle distance. He told her he had seen what was inside it. Something moved across her face at that. Brief, controlled, gone before he could name it. He asked her not to go. The words came out plainly, without the architecture of persuasion he was accustomed to constructing, without the careful management of tone he used in every other significant conversation of his life. He simply asked. And the asking undid him more than he had anticipated, because it revealed to him in real time how much he had been withholding from himself. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The garden held its gray stillness around them. Then she turned and looked at him. Really looked at him the way she had stopped allowing herself to look a long time ago. And she said something that no amount of title or fortune or authority could protect a man from. She said she needed to know if he was asking her to stay because he could not imagine losing her, or simply because he could not imagine the inconvenience of her leaving. Sebastian opened his mouth, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not have an answer prepared. Word traveled, as it always does, before either of them had decided what the word should be. By the following week, it was known, in the careful, circuitous way that things become known in their world, that something had shifted at Ashford Manor, that the Duchess had been seen in the garden in conversation with the Duke, and that the Duke had not looked like himself, that Mrs. Aldwyn had turned away a morning caller on Tuesday without explanation, that Lady Cecile Marne had arrived at the usual afternoon gathering and found for the first time that Sebastian Holt was not present and had sent no word. Cecile had composed herself beautifully, as she always did. But those who watched closely, and there were always those who watched closely, noted that she had set down her teacup with slightly more deliberateness than usual. She had stayed the full appropriate duration and left without lingering, which was not her custom. Something had been communicated to her without a single direct word being spoken, and she had received it with the grace of a woman who knows how to absorb a loss and reveal nothing. Society admired her for it and pitied her quietly, and moved on with the swift, merciless ease of a world that always prefers a new story to an old loyalty. As for Sebastian, the man who had never been the subject of public discussion, who had moved through his entire life on the safe side of other people's scrutiny, he found himself for the first time observed, not with cruelty, with something worse, with interest, with the particular attention a room gives to a man who is believed to be attempting to correct a mistake everyone else saw long before he did. He had spent 4 years being quietly blamed in drawing rooms he never entered. Now he was being watched, and the watching, he discovered, was its own form of reckoning. Eleanor came to him 2 days later in the library, his space, not hers, which he understood was deliberate. She sat across from him with her hands folded on the table and her spine straight, and her eyes carrying the calm of a woman who has rehearsed nothing because she has long ago made peace with what she needs to say. She told him she had not yet left. He said he knew. She told him that did not mean she had decided to stay. She spoke without anger, which made it harder to bear than anger would have been. She told him that if she remained, it would not be as the woman he had been married to for the past 4 years, not the one who watched the door and said nothing and wore the blue dress and hoped to be noticed and quietly, privately, dismantled herself trying to fit into a shape he had never once indicated he wanted. That woman, she said, had packed her bag. Whatever came next would have to be built on something different, something honest, something chosen, something that required him to be present in a way he had never yet managed. She asked for 3 things. She asked to be spoken to, not addressed, not informed, but actually spoken to, the way one speaks to a person whose thoughts matter. She asked to be considered before decisions were made that affected her life, and she asked, last, for one simple truth from him, something real, something he had never told her, something that might begin to explain the distance she had lived inside for 4 years. Sebastian looked at her across the library table and understood that she was not asking for a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration. She was asking for the one thing he had spent his entire life refusing to give. She was asking him to be known. Sebastian spoke slowly, the way a man speaks when he is dismantling something he built over a very long time. He told her about his parents, not the version society knew, the elegant couple with the grand estate and the impeccable reputation, but the version he had lived inside as a boy. The silences at dinner that were not peaceful, but weaponized. The way his mother had loved his father, openly, visibly, without reserve. And the way his father had received that love, as though it were a burden he had not requested and could not quite bring himself to return. He had watched her diminish, season by season, not from cruelty, but from indifference. And he had decided, at an age when decisions calcify into architecture, that he would never allow himself to be the one who loved more. He had married Eleanor because she was steady and dignified, and unlikely, he had calculated, to demand from him what his mother had demanded from his father. He had chosen her, in other words, precisely because something in her quietness had seemed safe. What he had not anticipated, what he was only now beginning to understand, sitting across from her in the library with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, was that her quietness had never been indifference. It had been patience. It had been hope, carefully maintained. And he had taken that hope and done nothing with it for 4 years, which was its own particular form of the thing he had spent his life trying not to become. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry for what he had witnessed as a child. She meant it. He could hear that she meant it, and it undid something in him to be offered gentleness in that moment, when he had given her so little reason for it. But then she said, gently and without cruelty, that she understood him better now, and that understanding him did not change what she had lived through. His past explained the architecture of his distance. It did not make the distance less real. She had spent 4 years inside it. She knew every corner of it by heart. It was Mrs. Aldwyn who told Eleanor about it 3 mornings later. In the quiet way she delivered all information she considered important. Without preamble, without embellishment, standing in the doorway with her hands folded and her eyes steady. She said that the Duke had dismissed his Thursday engagement, that he had eaten breakfast in the small dining room, not his study, not the formal room, but the small one, the one Eleanor had always preferred because it caught the morning light, that he had sat there alone at her table and eaten his breakfast in silence, and when the maid had come to clear, he had asked without looking up what her grace typically had with her tea. Eleanor stood very still when she heard this. It was not a grand gesture. She was clear-eyed enough to recognize that. It was a man sitting at a table and asking about his wife's breakfast preferences, which was, by any reasonable measure, the smallest possible thing. But it was also a man who had never before thought to ask, a man who had built his entire existence around not needing to know the small details of another person's daily life, sitting quietly in her morning light, trying, visibly, imperfectly, without an audience, to learn her. The smallness of it was precisely what made it impossible to dismiss. She did not go to him that morning. She needed to sit with it first, to hold it up against 4 years of absence and examine whether one breakfast table constituted the beginning of something real or simply the gesture of a man who was afraid of losing something he had never properly valued. But that evening, when she passed the small dining room and saw that a place had been set on both sides of the table, not by her instruction, not by habit, but by someone's quiet, deliberate choice, she stopped in the doorway, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she felt something other than tired. Eleanor had never believed in the kind of forgiveness that arrives suddenly, announced by tears and declarations, restructuring everything in a single evening. That was the forgiveness of stories, clean, complete, dramatically satisfying. Real forgiveness, in her experience, was slower and less certain. It was a decision made not once, but repeatedly, on ordinary mornings, in the middle of ordinary silences, when the old hurt surfaced and had to be consciously set aside in favor of something chosen rather than something felt. She told Sebastian this on a Sunday afternoon when they were both in the garden, not by arrangement, simply by coincidence, the kind that becomes less coincidental when two people have quietly begun to move toward the same spaces. She told him that she was not going to pretend the 4 years had not happened, that she was not going to perform a happiness she had not yet earned her way back to, that if they were to build something real, it would have to be built on the actual ground they were standing on, not on the fiction that they were starting fresh, because they were not starting fresh. They were starting honestly, which was harder, and the only version she was willing to attempt. Sebastian nodded. He did not argue, did not attempt to reframe, did not reach for the kind of reassuring language that would have made him feel better and her feel managed. He simply said he understood. And then, after a pause, he said something she had not expected. He said he was grateful she had packed the bag, that without it, he believed he would have continued indefinitely in the direction he had been going, and that the life at the end of that direction, now that he could see it clearly, was one he did not want. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. It was not a perfect thing to say, but it was an honest one. And honest, she had decided, was where they were beginning. The Whitmore reception was the first public event they attended together since the garden conversation, and Sebastian had requested, not instructed, requested, that Eleanor accompany him. She had considered it for 2 days before agreeing, and she had worn neither the blue dress nor the gray one, but something new, something she had chosen entirely for herself, in a color that suited her and had nothing to do with being noticed by anyone in particular. She had arrived, in other words, as herself. That felt important. Lady Cecile Marne was present, as she almost always was. She was positioned near the entrance to the main room when they arrived, and she looked, as always, immaculate, her smile arriving a fraction of a second before her words, her eyes moving between Sebastian and Eleanor with an assessment so swift and practiced it would have been invisible to anyone not paying attention. Eleanor was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. That had never been her failure. Sebastian felt the familiar pull of habit, the old social choreography, the pattern so well established it barely required thought. He did not follow it. He placed his hand at Eleanor's back, not as a performance, not with the self-conscious deliberateness of a man making a point, but with the quiet ease of someone who had decided where he stood and no longer needed to announce it. He steered them gently past Cecile with a nod of acknowledgement that was courteous and complete and final, the kind that closes a door without slamming it. And then he bent slightly toward Eleanor and asked, in a low voice, whether she would like a drink or preferred to find somewhere quieter. It was a small thing. In that room, on that evening, it was everything. Spring came to Ashford Manor differently that year. Eleanor noticed it first in the small things. The way Sebastian lingered at the breakfast table now, unhurried, occasionally reading aloud something from the morning correspondence that he thought might interest her. The way he had begun to knock before entering rooms that were hers. The way he had learned, without being asked a second time, that she took her tea without sugar, that she preferred the East Garden in the afternoon, that she did not like to be interrupted when she was reading, but that she did not mind company as long as it was quiet. He was learning her. Slowly, imperfectly, with the particular focus of a man who understands he is making up for lost time and has decided to spend that time well. Mrs. Aldwyn noticed the change the way she noticed everything, without comment, with deep attention. She saw the bag removed from Eleanor's chamber and returned to the wardrobe. She saw 2 cups on the morning tray instead of 1. She saw the Duchess of Ashford walk through the entrance hall of Ashford Manor one afternoon with her hands relaxed at her sides and something in her expression that was not performance and not endurance, but something rarer and more valuable. The look of a woman who has chosen where she is, rather than simply remaining where she was placed. Mrs. Aldwyn said nothing. She simply allowed herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to be glad. Eleanor never forgot the 4 years. She had not promised to forget them, and Sebastian had not asked her to. What she had promised, quietly to herself, on a morning in early spring when the garden was just beginning to come back, and the light was the particular gold that follows a long gray season, was to remain open to the possibility that people can change when the cost of not changing finally becomes real to them. Sebastian had paid that cost. He was still paying it in the daily, unglamorous work of becoming present in a life he had once treated as a formality. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was two people standing on honest ground, choosing each other. Not because it was arranged, not because it was expected, but because, after everything, it was true. Eleanor Sinclair arrived in that house as someone's last choice. She left it, in every way that truly matters, as his only one. Not because he was perfect, not because the 4 years were erased, but because two people decided, on honest ground, to finally begin. If this story moved you, like this video, and let the algorithm know that these stories deserve to be found, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being overlooked is never the same as being unworthy. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to DukeDom Stories, because there are more worlds like this one waiting for you, every week, every time. We'll see you in the next story.